The governor's mansion looms over the territorial capital, a fortress of sandstone and stern windows that promises order but offers no warmth. From its highest balcony, a man can see the entire sprawl of progress and desperation. The neat grid of commerce giving way to the chaotic tumble of lean-tos and dusty yards where hope is a currency in short supply. Inside this fortress, Governor Alastair Finch is a lonely king. He moves through cavernous rooms filled with the ghosts of laughter, the silence broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock that measures out his solitary days. Today, however, he is not in his castle. He is in a place he rarely frequents, a world of calico and lace, of chattering women and the scent of lavender water. He is in the city's finest mercantile, a man in a plain, dark suit standing in the shadows of a display of imported fabrics, an island of quiet gravity in a sea of frivolous noise. He is here for a purpose he keeps to himself, observing the social machinery of the city he governs. And he sees her. She is not part of the chattering flock. She stands apart, a small, still figure by a barrel of fabric scraps. Her dress is the color of a faded sky, meticulously patched but undeniably worn. Her hands, resting protectively over the gentle swell of her belly, are raw and chapped. She's a sparrow that has wandered into a cage of peacocks, and the peacocks have noticed. A woman whose silk dress rustles with the sound of her husband's wealth, a Mrs. Gable, turns to her companions, her voice a stage whisper designed to carry. Good heavens, look at the state of that. It's a wonder Mr. Abernathy allows such riffraff in his establishment. Her friends titter, their eyes flicking toward the pregnant woman with a shared, venomous disdain. And in her condition, another adds a little louder. Utterly shameless, the young woman, Elara, though Alastair does not know her name, flinches as if struck. Her shoulders curl inward, and her gaze drops to the splintered floorboards, her cheeks burning with a flush of deep humiliation. She was only hoping for a small piece of flannel, something soft for the baby that was coming, but now she wishes only for the ground to swallow her whole. She is a disgrace, a piece of shabby cloth to be mocked and discarded. The governor steps from the shadows. The air in the mercantile changes instantly. The frivolous chatter dies. The rustle of silk ceases. All eyes turn to him, surprise and deference smoothing the cruel lines from their faces. He ignores them all. His focus is singular, his voice calm, but carrying the unmistakable weight of command as he addresses the suddenly obsequious shopkeeper. "Mr. Abernathy," he says, his gaze still fixed on the back of the small, trembling woman. "I find myself in need of a seamstress." Immediately, the shopkeeper blinks, thrown. "Of course, Governor. I can recommend several." Alastair cuts him off, his voice soft but absolute, an iron blade wrapped in velvet. "That will not be necessary." He takes a step forward, and the women part for him like the Red Sea. He stops beside the young woman, who is frozen, too terrified to even look up. "I require a complete wardrobe made," he announces to the silent room, his words a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet. "And I believe I have just found the artist for the job." That was a close call. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The insult, sharp and public, was not a new kind of pain for Elara Miller, but its setting had given it a fresh sting. Humiliation felt different under the bright, accusatory lights of the city mercantile than it did in the quiet shadows of her own failures. She had walked out of that shop in a daze, the governor's words echoing in her ears, a pronouncement so absurd it felt like a dream or a cruel joke. She did not remember the walk back to the single room she rented behind a noisy tannery, a space that smelled perpetually of lie and misery. She had arrived in the capital 6 weeks prior, a widow whose husband, a kind tailor with big dreams, had succumbed to a fever on the trail west. He had left her with little more than his box of well-worn shears, a thimble that fit her finger perfectly, and a baby growing under her heart. She had his skill in her hands, the memory of his patient instruction a constant, bittersweet companion. She knew fabric the way a farmer knew soil. She could read the drape of a bolt of wool from across a room and could stitch a seam so straight and fine it looked as if it had been drawn by an architect's pen. But in this city, her shabby dress and swelling belly were the only parts of her story anyone cared to read. They were a testament to her poverty and her supposed moral failing, closing every respectable door before she could even raise a hand to knock. Now, a formal-looking man in a stiff collar, the governor's aide, had found her. He'd inquired at the tannery, his nose wrinkled in distaste, and delivered a summons as if it were a death sentence. She was to present herself at the governor's mansion at 9 the following morning. The summons now lay on her small, rickety table, a crisp, white square of impossibility in her dingy world. Fear, cold and sharp, warred with a sliver of hope so fragile it was almost painful. It was a prank. It had to be, or worse, a proposition of a kind she couldn't bear to contemplate. Governors did not hire penniless, pregnant widows they'd met by a scrap barrel. They had their pick of the city's finest couturiers, women with fashionable shops and impeccable reputations. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at her window, looking out at the brick wall of the neighboring building, and worked. She took her own dress apart at the seams. She washed the faded blue fabric until her hands were raw, scrubbing away the dust of the road and the grime of the city. She pressed it with a sad iron heated on her tiny stove, and then she recut it. Her shears whispered through the warm material, finding a new line, a new life within the old. She adjusted the bodice to better accommodate her changing shape, turning the worn collar under, adding a small, pleated detail at the cuffs from salvage scrap. It was still a poor woman's dress, but it was now a dress of profound and defiant dignity. It was the only armor she had. The next morning, under a sky the color of slate, she walked to the other side of the city, a world away from her own. The houses grew larger, the lawns greener, until she stood before the governor's mansion itself. It was an imposing structure of cut stone and dark wood, with windows that watched her like impassive eyes. It felt less like a home and more like a courthouse. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she walked up the stone steps and lifted the heavy brass knocker. The door was opened by a stern-faced housekeeper who looked Alara up and down with an expression of barely concealed disapproval. The aide from the day before appeared and led her through a grand, echoing foyer. The air inside was cool and smelled of beeswax and old paper. Her worn boots made no sound on the thick, imported rugs. They passed portraits of stern-faced men and one of a woman with sad, gentle eyes, a woman who looked like she might have offered a kind word. Alara felt a pang of longing for that face. She was shown into a vast study. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in. And behind a desk of dark, polished mahogany sat Governor Alastair Finch. He did not look like a governor. He looked like a man burdened by the weight of the world. His hair had threads of silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes were etched deep. He watched her enter, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Miller," he said. His voice was the same as it had been in the store, low, calm, and resonant. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Thank you for coming." Alara simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. She clutched her small reticule, her knuckles white. He gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "Please." She sat on the very edge of the leather seat, her back ramrod straight. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Alastair cleared his throat. He seemed, for the first time, uncertain. "I have a commission for you," he began, his eyes fixed on a point just over her shoulder. "I am the guardian of a young ward, a niece. She is coming to live with me soon, and she will require a complete wardrobe. Gowns for day and evening, walking suits, riding habits, the full complement." Alara's mind reeled. A ward. This was the explanation. It was still incredible, but it was logical. It was business. A small measure of the tension in her shoulders eased. "I see, sir. The work would require you to be here at the mansion. I've had a room prepared for you to use as a workshop. You would, of course, be compensated for your time and provided with all necessary materials," he paused. "And meals. You must eat," he added, a flicker of something almost paternal in his tone. This was the lifeline she had prayed for, delivered in the most surreal manner imaginable. A safe place to work. Food. A way to provide for her child. It was too much to take in. "Governor, I don't know what to say. My work, you've never seen it." For the first time, he met her eyes directly. His were a deep, clear gray, like a winter sky. "I saw your dress, Mrs. Miller," he said quietly. "Yesterday and today. I saw the stitches. That is all the recommendation I require." He stood and walked to a heavy door at the side of the study, opening it. He beckoned her to follow. The room beyond was a guest chamber, but it had been transformed. In the center stood a dressmaker's dummy. Bolts of fabric were stacked against one wall. Silks in jewel tones, fine wools, crisp cottons, and delicate lace. It was a king's ransom of material, more than she had seen in her entire life. On a large cutting table lay spools of thread, boxes of pins, and a brand-new set of gleaming shears. Alara stopped in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth. The beauty and possibility of it all overwhelmed her. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, tears of disbelief and profound, shuddering relief. She thought of the mocking laughter in the mercantile, of Mrs. Gable's cruel face. And then she looked at the quiet, stern man beside her who had somehow seen past the shabby dress to the skill in her hands. "When would you have me start?" she asked, her voice trembling but clear. Alistair looked at the untouched fabrics, then back at her. A faint, almost imperceptible softening occurred at the corners of his mouth. "Whenever you are ready, Mrs. Miller," he replied. "The room is yours." Her new life began in that room, a sun-filled space that felt like a sanctuary. For the first few days, Alara and the governor existed in a state of formal, distant orbit. He would show her the room in the morning, and she would find a tray with a simple, nourishing lunch left discreetly outside her door at midday. In the evenings, the aide would appear to tell her a room had been prepared for her in the staff quarters, a small but clean and comfortable space that felt like a palace after her hovel by the tannery. She began her work with a reverence that bordered on worship. She handled the fabrics, the smooth, cool slide of silk, the sturdy warmth of wool, as if they were sacred texts. Her first task was to take measurement from the dressmaker's dummy, which Alistair had informed her was padded to the approximate size of his niece. Alara found the story plausible, if a little strange. She'd heard of wealthy guardians being fastidious. She poured all her focus, all her gratitude and pent-up skill into the first garment, a simple day dress of deep green chalice. Her shears sliced through the material with a satisfying whisper. Her needle flew, each stitch a tiny, perfect prayer of thanks. The work consumed her. It was a balm to her frayed nerves and a shield against the lingering echoes of public shame. In this room, she was not the poor, pregnant widow. She was an artist. The rhythmic push and pull of the needle was the only thing that made sense in a world that had ceased to. Alistair found himself making excuses to pass by the open door of her workroom. He would be on his way to his study or to a meeting with territorial delegates, and his feet would slow, his path would deviate. He would stand for a moment in the hallway, unseen, and watch her. He saw the intense concentration on her face, the way she bit her lower lip when tackling a difficult seam. He saw the innate grace in her movements, the fluid economy of an expert at her craft. He had hired her out of a moment of impulsive, righteous anger, a rebellion against the casual cruelty of the city's elite. He had expected to provide charity, to give a desperate woman a hand up. He had not expected to be so captivated. One afternoon, he brought in a tray himself. It held a cup of tea and a plate of small cakes left over from a meeting. He set it down on the edge of her cutting table. Alara looked up, startled, her cheeks flushed from bending over her work. "I thought you might need some refreshment," he said, his tone gruff, as if he were annoyed at his own impulse. She looked at the tray, then at him. Her eyes were wide and wary. For a woman who had been starving, Her pride was a fortress. She saw the gesture not as kindness, but as another form of charity, a reminder of her dependence. "Thank you, Governor, but I am fine," she said, her voice polite but stiff. She turned back to her work, her shoulders rigid. Alistair felt a surge of frustration, then a surprising pang of hurt. He had managed it badly. He was a man of policies and laws, not of delicate gestures. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice firmer than he intended, "the work is demanding. You are eating for two. You will not be effective if you are not well. Consider it a requirement of the job." She looked up again, and this time, she saw something past his stern facade. She saw the awkwardness, the flicker of genuine concern in his gray eyes. It wasn't pity. It was something else, something human. A tiny fissure appeared in the wall she had built around herself. "Thank you, Governor," she said, her voice softer this time. She reached for the teacup, her calloused fingers brushing against the fine porcelain. "That is very thoughtful." He gave a curt nod and retreated, feeling strangely exposed. The brief exchange had felt more perilous than negotiating a treaty with the Ute. He went back to his study, but the image of her small, proud face stayed with him. He had intended to create a simple, transactional arrangement to save a woman from destitution. He was beginning to realize it was far more complicated than that. He had invited a life force into his silent, orderly house, and he was not at all prepared for the ways it was beginning to change the landscape of his own heart. Days melted into a week, then two, establishing a quiet rhythm within the stone walls of the mansion. Alara's world shrank to the sunlit workroom, the clean, sparse bedroom, and the path between them. It was a monastic existence, but for the first time in months, it was a peaceful one. The fear of starvation and homelessness had receded, replaced by the steady, tangible progress of her work. The green chalice dress was completed, its lines simple and elegant, its construction flawless. She hung it on the dummy, a silent offering, and began cutting a walking suit from a handsome blue serge. Alistair continued his silent observations, his heart a tangle of conflicting emotions. He was the governor, a man of public duty and private grief. His wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 5 years, and with her, she had taken all the light and warmth from the mansion. He had filled the void with work, building a shell of routine and responsibility around his loneliness. Alara's presence was a disruption he hadn't anticipated. She was quiet, unobtrusive, yet her influence was pervasive. The scent of hot irons and fresh-cut fabric now mingled with the old smells of beeswax and leather. The soft scratch of her shears was a new, living sound in the house's profound silence. He saw the evidence of her past hardships in the way she ate, slowly, as if savoring every bite, never leaving a crumb. He saw it in the fierce, protective way her hands would drift to her belly whenever she thought she was unobserved. But he also saw a strength that humbled him. He saw the pride she took in her skill, the resilience in her spine, the quiet courage that had brought her across a continent alone. He had thought he was saving her, but he was beginning to suspect she was, in some small, inexplicable way, saving him. His niece remained a convenient fiction, a necessary artifice that allowed them both to maintain a comfortable distance. He provided the materials, and Alara provided the labor. It was a clean, respectable arrangement. Yet the pretense was beginning to feel thin. One evening, he came into the workroom to find her sketching designs in a small notebook by the light of a lamp. The floor around her was littered with discarded attempts. "You are a designer as well as a seamstress, Mrs. Miller?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She looked up, a smudge of charcoal on her cheek. She seemed less like a wary sparrow now and more like a focused scholar. "My husband taught me," she said, a shadow of sorrow crossing her face before she mastered it. "He always said the cut was more important than the cloth, that a good design could make even the humblest fabric sing." She looked down at her sketch. "I'm just trying to imagine what a young woman would want to wear. Your niece, is she vivacious? Or more reserved?" The direct question caught Alistair off guard. He had given the fictional ward no personality, no substance. He floundered for a moment. "She is quiet," he said, grasping for a plausible detail. "Thoughtful. She enjoys reading." Alara nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Like me," she said softly. "Then she would not want a lot of fussy ribbons and lace. She would want clean lines. Elegance. Something that doesn't shout." She made a few quick, confident strokes on the page. "I understand." In that moment, Alistair felt a sharp, painful pang of guilt. This woman was pouring her soul into creating a wardrobe for a ghost, a phantom born of his lie. She was investing her talent and her empathy into a person who did not exist. He had wanted to give her dignity, but he had built their arrangement on a foundation of deceit. The truth sat like a stone in his gut, but he couldn't bring himself to speak it. To tell her the truth would be to unravel the whole fragile tapestry he had woven. It would mean admitting that he, the governor, had acted on a moment of raw, uncalculated pity. It would shatter the professional distance that kept them both safe. And so he remained silent, the lie a growing chasm between them. The blue serge walking suit was nearing completion, and Alara needed a specific type of braided trim to finish the jacket. It was not something Alistair had in his vast collection of supplies. With a reluctance that felt like a physical weight, she knew she would have to return to the world outside the mansion's gates. She would have to go back to Abernathy's mercantile. Alistair provided her with a generous amount of money, pressing several large bills into her hand and waving away her protests. "The trim is an expense of the project, Mrs. Miller. You will not use your own funds." Dressed in her remade blue gown, which now fit more snugly over her growing belly, she walked into town. The air felt different this time. She felt different. The security of her position at the mansion was a shield, invisible but potent. She held her head a little higher, her steps more purposeful. But a shield can only deflect so much. As she stood at the counter waiting for Mr. Abernathy to fetch the trim, she heard that same dreaded rustle of silk behind her. It was Mrs. Gable, flanked by her usual coterie of sharp-eyed women. Mrs. Gable's eyes swept over Alara, taking in the clean dress, the healthy color in her cheeks. Her gaze was sharp with malice. She leaned toward her friend, her voice once again a carrying whisper. Well, it seems the governor's charity has been most effective. Look at her, buying the best trim. I wonder what sort of services she's been providing in that big, empty house to earn such favor." The friend snickered. "They say he hasn't been the same since his wife died. A lonely man is a vulnerable man." The words were like a spray of poison darts. Alara froze, the blood draining from her face. This was worse than being called shabby. The previous insult had attacked her station. This one attacked her character and the governor's. It twisted his act of kindness into something sordid and ugly. The whispers were no longer just about her. They were a contagion that would infect him, too. She paid for her trim with trembling hands, not meeting the shopkeeper's suddenly curious gaze. She fled the store, the women's quiet, triumphant laughter following her out into the street. The walk back to the mansion felt like a mile of shame. The shield she had felt so secure behind had been shattered. She wasn't just a seamstress anymore. She was the subject of vicious gossip, a stain on the governor's reputation. She hid her distress from Alistair, burying herself in her work with a frantic energy. But he noticed the change immediately. The light in her eyes had dimmed. The quiet confidence she had been cultivating was gone, replaced by the old, haunted wariness. He saw her jump when he entered the room, her gaze skittering away from his. Alistair was not a man who frequented social circles, but he was not deaf. He had aides and staff who moved through the city, and whispers had a way of reaching the ears of power. His aide, Mr. Davies, a man of profound discretion, reported the rumor to him with clinical detachment. "There is talk, Governor," Davies had said, his eyes fixed on the inkwell on Alistair's desk, "regarding your new seamstress." Alistair's hands clenched into fists under the desk. "I'm aware of the talk, Davies." His voice was cold as ice. The casual, thoughtless cruelty of people like Mrs. Gable filled him with a rage that was hot and pure. He had tried to protect Alara, and in doing so, he had placed her in the direct line of fire. His lie, meant to be a kindness, had become the very fuel for their slander. He was responsible. The weight of that responsibility was immense, and it settled deep in his chest, a cold, heavy ache of guilt. He knew he should say something to her, to acknowledge the ugliness and reassure her. But the words wouldn't come. What could he say? Pay them no mind? Empty words. The damage was done. Any attempt to comfort her felt hollow as long as the lie about his niece stood between them. That evening, he found her in the workroom long after the sun had set. The walking suit was finished, perfect, and pristine on the dummy, but she wasn't looking at it. She was sitting by the window, her hands still, staring out into the darkness. She hadn't lit a lamp. He could see the faint glisten of tears on her cheeks in the moonlight. He didn't speak. He walked back to his study, fetched a thick wool blanket from the back of his own chair, and returned. He gently draped it over her shoulders. She started, a small, frightened gasp escaping her lips. "You'll catch a chill," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, the wool warm and smelling faintly of him, of leather and old books. She didn't look at him, but she didn't pull away. They sat there in the shared silence of the moonlit room, a lonely man and a frightened woman, bound together by a well-intentioned lie and the cruelty of the outside world. It was a moment of profound, unspoken connection. The barrier of their formal arrangement dissolved in the quiet dark, leaving only two vulnerable people finding a fragile solace in each other's presence. For the first time, the great, empty mansion felt, for a fleeting moment, like a home. The blanket became an unspoken treaty. In the days that followed, the oppressive formality between them softened, replaced by a quiet, watchful camaraderie. Alistair made it a point to take his afternoon tea in the workroom. Sitting in a chair, he'd moved into the corner, reading his reports while Alara worked. He'd make a quiet comment about the weather. She'd ask a hesitant question about the fabric. Their conversations were sparse, built of simple things. Yet each word was a carefully placed stone building a bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. Alara, wrapped in the memory of his small, profound act of kindness, began to see the man behind the title. She saw the weariness in the slump of his shoulders at the end of a long day. She noticed he always chose the chipped teacup from the tray. She saw the deep sadness that would settle in his eyes whenever he glanced at the portrait of his late wife in the main hall. He was not just the stern, powerful governor. He was a man hollowed out by loss, navigating a solitude as vast and daunting as her own poverty. Her own fear began to recede, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct. The town's gossip still stung, but now it felt like an attack not just on her, but on him, on this quiet, lonely man who had shown her a decency she had thought no longer existed. Her work took on a new urgency, a new purpose. Each stitch was an act of defiance against the whispers, a testament to the legitimacy of her place in this house. She was earning her keep. She was proving his faith in her was not misplaced. She moved on from the walking suit to a magnificent ball gown, using a bolt of sapphire silk that shimmered like a captured night sky. The project was ambitious, and it required her to work closely with the dressmaker's dummy, the silent proxy for the governor's fictional niece. She draped the silk, pinned the bodice, and sculpted the fabric, her imagination painting a picture of the quiet, bookish young woman who would wear it. She poured all her artistry into the gown, wanting it to be a masterpiece, a gift for the girl, and a tribute to the man who had made it possible. One afternoon, as Alistair sat in his corner, she held up a piece of delicate, silver-threaded lace against the sapphire silk of the bodice. "What do you think, Governor?" she asked, her shyness momentarily forgotten in her creative focus. "Is this too much for her, or does it add the right touch of evening sparkle?" Alistair looked up from his papers. He didn't see the lace or the silk. He saw Alara, her face animated, her eyes bright with passion for her craft. He saw the way the afternoon sun caught the gold in her hair and the gentle, proud curve of her belly. The lie about his niece felt suddenly, intolerably heavy. He was asking this vibrant, talented woman to invest her heart in a shadow. "It is beautiful, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice strained. "She will love it." He stood abruptly and left the room, unable to bear the weight of her earnest, trusting gaze. His abrupt departure left Alara confused and hurt. She felt she had overstepped, broken the unspoken rules of their arrangement. The warmth that had been growing between them seemed to vanish, replaced by the old, formal distance. For the next 2 days, Alistair did not come for tea. The lunch trays were once again left by the aide. The silence of the mansion felt oppressive again, no longer peaceful, but empty. Alara's anxiety returned, a cold knot in her stomach. She had ruined it. She had grown too comfortable, too familiar. The gossip must have finally gotten to him. He was regretting his impulsive decision, and he was withdrawing, preparing to send her away. The thought was unbearable. This sanctuary, this fragile peace, she couldn't lose it. Not now. The announcement came on a Friday, delivered by Mr. Davies. The annual Governor's Ball would be held in 3 weeks' time. It was the most important social event of the year in the territory, a command performance for the city's elite. For Alara, the news landed like a death knell. This glittering event would bring all of them, Mrs. Gable and her circle, the whispering politicians, the judgmental townspeople, right here into the heart of her sanctuary. The rumors would be everywhere. She and her growing belly would be on display, a living scandal in the governor's own home. She would be the ruin of him. She knew what she had to do. She could not let his act of charity destroy his reputation. That evening, after the staff had retired, she gathered her courage and went to his study. She knocked softly on the heavy oak door. "Enter," his voice called out, weary and distant. She stepped inside. He was standing by the window, staring out at the dark gardens, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He turned, and his face was a mask of exhaustion. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice flat. "Governor, I need to speak with you," she began, her own voice trembling. She twisted her hands together. "The ball. I cannot be here when it happens. The things people are saying. I will not be the cause of your disgrace. I will be packed and gone in the morning." Alistair stared at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Disgrace," he repeated softly. "You think your presence here is a disgrace. They are saying vile things," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "That I am your mistress. That this child—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "You have been kind to me, kinder than anyone. I will not repay that kindness by ruining you." She finally looked up at him, her heart breaking. "I have to tell you the truth. My husband, he died on the trail. I came here with nothing. I was desperate. You saved me, and I am so grateful. But I cannot stay and let these lies fester." She stood there, braced for his dismissal, for his cold nod of agreement. Instead, he walked slowly toward her, his face etched with a pain that seemed to mirror her own. He stopped just before her, his gray eyes searching hers. "No, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is I who must tell you the truth." He took a deep breath, the confession tearing its way out of him. "There is no niece. There is no ward." Alara stared at him, utterly bewildered. I don't understand." "She doesn't exist," he said, the words heavy with shame. "I invented her. In a mercantile that day, I saw their cruelty. I heard what they said to you. I cannot abide it. The anger, it was an old anger for me. I acted without thinking. I saw your skill in the mending of your own dress, and I concocted a story that would give you a safe harbor, a way to earn your living with the dignity you deserved." He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "The wardrobe was a lie meant to protect you, but it has only put you in more danger. The disgrace is mine, Mrs. Miller, for my deception and for what it has cost you." The confession hung in the air between them, stunning Alara into silence. There was no niece. The quiet, bookish girl she had been designing for was a phantom. The entire arrangement, her entire world for the past month, had been built on his fabrication. But it wasn't a cruel lie. It was a desperate, compassionate one. He had not offered her pity. He had offered her respect, cloaked in a fiction to protect her pride. All the fear and shame that had been churning inside her dissolved, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful it took her breath away. He hadn't just given her a job. He had seen her. He had looked past the shabby dress and the scandal of her pregnancy and seen a person worthy of dignity. "Alistair," she said, the name leaving her lips for the first time, a sound both strange and perfectly natural. He looked up, startled by the intimacy of it. "You did it to be kind," she said softly, her tears falling freely now, but they were not tears of sorrow. "It was the kindest lie I have ever been told." In that moment, the last wall between them crumbled. He was no longer the governor, and she was no longer the seamstress. They were just two lonely souls who had found an unexpected anchor in one another. A new resolve hardened Alistair's face, chasing away the shame. He would not let the vipers win. He would not let them tear this down. "You will not be leaving, Illyria," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that sent a thrill through her. "You will stay, and you will finish that sapphire gown." "But the ball." "Yes, the ball," he said, a fierce light in his eyes. "You will finish the gown, because you're going to wear it. You will go to the governor's ball on my arm, as my honored guest." It wasn't a question. It was a declaration of war. A war on gossip, on cruelty, on the suffocating judgment of their small-minded world. And they would fight it together. The 3 weeks leading up to the ball were a whirlwind of focused, conspiratorial energy. The workroom was no longer just a place of employment. It was a command center. The lie of the niece was gone, and in its place was a shared, audacious truth. Illyria was no longer sewing for a phantom. She was creating her own armor for the battle to come. Alistair was a constant presence, no longer a silent observer in the corner, but an active participant. He'd hold up swatches of lace for her consideration, his large, capable hands looking surprisingly gentle against the delicate fabric. He'd listen, fascinated, as she explained the complex architecture of a sleeve or the precise way to drape a skirt so it moved like water. They spoke of everything and nothing, of the books he loved, of the wildflowers she missed from her childhood home, of the future she dreamed of for her baby. The mansion, once a bastion of silence and sorrow, was now filled with the low murmur of their voices and, on occasion, the surprising sound of shared, quiet laughter. The sapphire gown became a testament to their strange, evolving partnership. It was more than a dress. It was a symbol of her artistry and his defiance. She poured every ounce of her skill into it. The silk was cut on the bias, a difficult and wasteful technique that ensured the fabric would cling and flow with an unparalleled grace. The bodice was structured with an expert's hand, designed to support and flatter her pregnant form, celebrating it rather than concealing it. She did not add the silver lace. At Alistair's suggestion, she instead embroidered the neckline with a subtle, elegant pattern of night-blooming jasmine, a flower that, he had told her, was his late wife's favorite. It was a secret, shared tribute, a weaving together of his past and her present. As the day of the ball drew near, a nervous tension settled over the house. The staff, sensing the shift in the atmosphere and fiercely loyal to the governor, moved with a quiet efficiency, their expressions revealing nothing to the gossiping delivery men and tradespeople who came and went. Illyria felt a familiar flutter of fear in her stomach, but it was different now. It was the fear of a soldier before a charge, not the terror of a victim awaiting a blow. She was no longer alone. On the evening of the ball, the mansion was transformed. Hundreds of candles blazed in chandeliers, their light glinting off crystal glasses and polished silver. An orchestra played softly in the grand ballroom, the music a river of sound flowing through the opulent rooms. Carriages arrived one after another, disgorging the territory's elite in a wave of satin, jewels, and smug self-importance. The air was thick with perfume and speculation. Everyone was waiting. They had all heard the rumors, and they were hungry for the drama to unfold. Upstairs, in her room, Illyria dressed. When she looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman who stared back was not the shabby, downtrodden creature from the mercantile. She was regal, The sapphire gown was a masterpiece, a second skin of midnight silk that shimmered with every breath she took. The cut was so exquisite that it made her pregnancy look not like a mark of shame, but like a symbol of life and grace, a gentle, central curve around which the whole magnificent design flowed. Her hair was swept up in a simple but elegant twist, and her only adornment was her own quiet confidence. There was a soft knock on her door. It was Alistair. He stood in the hallway, dressed in a perfectly tailored black evening suit. When he saw her, he stopped breathing. All the words he had prepared, all the reassurances, vanished from his mind. He was struck dumb by the sheer force of her transformation, by the powerful beauty she radiated. It was the beauty of resilience, of talent, of a spirit that had refused to be broken. "Alara," he finally managed, his voice thick. "You are magnificent." She gave him a small, tremulous smile. "It is a well-made dress, Governor." "No," he said, stepping forward and offering her his arm. "It is the woman wearing it." She took his arm, her hand resting on his sleeve. The contact was electric, a current of shared purpose. Together, they walked toward the grand staircase, toward the heart of the battle. As they appeared at the top of the stairs, a hush fell over the crowded ballroom below. The music faltered. The chatter died. Every single head turned upward. They saw their stern, solitary governor, and on his arm was the woman from the rumors, the pregnant seamstress. But she was not what they expected. She was not a cowering, shabby waif. She was a queen. They descended the staircase, each step a deliberate, measured act of defiance. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the whisper of her silk gown on the marble steps. They reached the bottom, and the crowd seemed to recoil, parting before them. The whisper started then, a venomous, sibilant hiss that spread through the room like wildfire. And then, stepping forward as if on cue, was Mrs. Gable. Her face was flushed with wine and malice, her smile a painted slash of red. She positioned herself directly in their path, her cronies fanning out behind her. "Governor," she said, her voice dripping with saccharine poison, loud enough for the entire room to hear. What a surprising choice of companion for the evening. One might almost be tempted to believe the rumors were true. This was it, the moment of confrontation. Alara's hand tightened on Alistair's arm, but it was steady as rock. He looked down at Mrs. Gable, his expression not of anger, but of a profound and weary disappointment. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the clarity of a bell. "Mrs. Gable," he began, his gaze sweeping over the silent, watching faces. "You are correct that the rumors are untrue. But you are profoundly mistaken about the source of the shame in this matter." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I was in the mercantile some weeks ago. I witnessed your behavior. I saw a woman of immense talent, courage, and dignity being scorned by those who possess none of those qualities. The disgrace is not Mrs. Miller's for her circumstances. The disgrace belongs to you, and to any person who would find sport in cruelty." A collective gasp went through the room. Mrs. Gable's painted smile faltered, her face paling under its rouge. Alistair turned his attention to the wider audience. "To quell the gossip your malice has spawned," he continued, his voice resonating with gubernatorial authority, "let me be clear. I commissioned a full wardrobe for Mrs. Miller because I recognized, as any person with eyes could, that she is the finest seamstress in this territory. The proof of her artistry is before you now, in this magnificent gown. She is here tonight not as a charity case, not as the subject of your sordid speculation, but as an honored artisan and as my personal, esteemed guest." Without another glance at the stunned and humiliated Mrs. Gable, he turned to Alara. "Mrs. Miller," he said softly, for her ears only, "may I have this dance?" The orchestra, taking its cue, swelled to life. He led her to the center of the vast, empty dance floor. He placed one hand on her waist, took her hand with his other, and they began to move. For a long moment, they were the only two people in the universe, dancing in a circle of light surrounded by a sea of stunned silence. Then, slowly, one by one, Other couples began to join them on the floor, deliberately turning their backs on Mrs. Gable and her circle. It was a quiet, powerful shift, an abdication of her social power and an endorsement of his. He had not just defended her, he had championed her. He had taken the shame they had tried to heap upon her and handed it back to them. As he held her, guiding her through the steps of the waltz, Alara looked up at his strong, kind face. In his eyes, she saw not a governor, but a man of deep integrity, a man she was beginning to love. And in that moment, under the blazing chandeliers, with the entire world watching, she knew she was finally, truly safe. When the waltz ended, the spell was broken by a wave of polite applause. Several people, the mayor, a respected judge, their wives, made a point of approaching to be introduced to Alara, complimenting her gown and welcoming her with a warmth that was in stark contrast to the earlier chill. The tide had turned. The tension of the last few weeks, the fear and anticipation of the confrontation, drained away, leaving a profound sense of peace in its wake. "Thank you," Alara said, her voice soft. She turned to face him. "You didn't have to do that. You risked everything." "I risked nothing," Alistair countered, his gaze serious and tender as he looked at her. "I simply chose decency over cruelty." It should not be a difficult choice. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His touch was warm and firm. "The risk was all yours. You were the one who had to be brave enough to walk down those stairs." "I wasn't alone," she whispered, her heart full. In this quiet space, away from the prying eyes, the truth of her feelings was undeniable. She was no longer the frightened widow, and he was no longer just her benefactor. They were partners, allies who had faced down a common enemy and won. He looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "Alara," he began, his voice hesitant, "what will you do now?" "The wardrobe is complete." The question hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement that their formal arrangement was over. A pang of fear shot through her, but she pushed it down. She was not the same woman who had arrived at his doorstep. He had given her more than safety. He had given her back her self-respect. "I plan to open a dress shop," she said, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke the dream aloud for the first time. "A small one at first, but I'll make it the finest in the territory." A slow smile spread across Alistair's face, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his stern features and made her heart ache with affection. "I have no doubt that you will," he said, "and I know for a fact that it will have at least one loyal customer from the very beginning." His gaze dropped to her belly, where their child rested beneath the shimmering silk. He lifted his other hand and, with a reverence that took her breath away, gently placed it over her womb. The gesture was one of utter acceptance, a quiet promise for a future she hadn't dared to imagine. "And perhaps," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur, "another one on the way." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. The vast, lonely mansion behind them no longer felt like a fortress or a courthouse. It felt like a beginning. The insults and the shame were now just a faint, distant echo, the bitter prologue to a story that was only just starting. Here on this balcony, under the silent watch of the stars, a lonely governor and a pregnant seamstress had discovered that the most beautiful things could be stitched together from the most unlikely threads of compassion and courage. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.